Hello and welcome to the latest in the AQR series of webinars, the Hub. My name is Peter Dann. This one's called How Ethnographic is Mobile Ethnography. And I should explain that you're not listening to a recording of the live webinar. The original had a fair amount of video recordings in it, and for posterity, for the version that's going to sit on the AQR website through YouTube, we've taken those videos out for the sake of the respondents that featured in them. So you'll have to put up with my explanations. You'll also have to put up with the version without the lively banter or the introduction from Ken Parker, who's kind enough to host these events. I should also explain, when I was asked to do this webinar, the idea was to share bits of the paper that I did at the MRS conference earlier in the year, 2016, if you're listening in subsequent years. I'm afraid, though, that my MRS papers are a bit less of paper and a bit more of knockabout comedy with some Google images thrown in. And the MRS version was a thinly disguised sales pitch for Journey HQ, which is an app we've developed with ethnographer and all-round guru Siamak Solari. Because this is the AQR, though, I've added in some more thinking bits. What that does mean, though, is that if you were at the conference, you might be marginally less disappointed now than you were then. But since this version hasn't really got any jokes in, you might start recognising stuff halfway through, so do feel free to switch off completely. Don't be too alarmed either by any references to the sales pitch. There is a gift shop at the end of the tour. You don't have to buy stuff, and we've got plenty of other ground to cover before we get there. In any case, Journey HQs run independently from the nursery, so you don't have to be seen to be buying stuff from your competitor in the shape of me. A bit like the Thinking Shed in Discovery, for instance. Speaking of which, we should all thank Ken for organising these hosting these webinars. And without further ado, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling a bit with the recording stuff here, I should quickly jump into the Google Images. This is what you get if you type me into Google Images. I am actually the people on the left and the right. The bloke at the bottom is the Peter Dann I want to be in another life. This is Penguin Pete from Phillip Island. It's much more interesting if you Google Ken, on the other hand. I didn't know at the time whether I was sitting next to Warrior Ken, Cowboy Ken, Ukulele Ken, Reggae Ken or Peeping Ken. That's very worrying, one in the bottom right-hand corner. It's going to make me think completely differently about watching groups behind the one-way mirror at Spectrum from now on. If you Google mobile ethnography, luckily, you get a rather bigger result either for me or for Ken. Mobile ethnography has absolutely taken the qual world by storm. And why not, really? What's not to like? It's generally the world of very simple apps. They're very easy for researchers to buy and very easy for researchers to use. And best of all, it's another excuse not to get on a train to Leeds on a wet Wednesday. It's really brought ethnography, which has only ever been quite a niche discipline, into the research mainstream. And it probably explains why there are 100 and something people registered for this webinar. Certainly not for my cheesy charts, but it's because people simply can't resist the title. Ethnography sounds way cooler than focus groups. This is all great. I'm a huge fan of ethnography. I'm also a fan of having the widest range of tools for us as researchers to use. But I do think there's a danger that in using such a specific term, we can confuse the implications for methodology and for results too. Ethnography, and I think this is pretty much the dictionary definition, is about understanding a whole culture, and specifically the term ethnography really refers to doing that from the perspective of its members. Often, not necessarily, but often by living within that culture, within that society. And observing it from within. Ethnographic research, on the other hand, uses some of these techniques, but it does so to answer very specific questions. Because we are market researchers, we're answering a brief, we're addressing an issue for our clients. And so we are answering very specific questions. We're not looking, unless we're very, very lucky, as social researchers, at all of a society. We're looking at how society addresses particular issues. So it's much more a subset of market research than it is of anthropology or ethnography itself in terms of a scientific discipline. So I do think it's worth knowing a bit about where ethnography has come from and how it's evolved. If only so that when we know that when we're using these methods for a different purpose, we're doing so consciously. This is Malinowski, by the way, the guy in the white clothes in the picture. I've forgotten his first name, but he was one of the founders of the Chicago School of Anthropological Ethnographers. Although you could say that the discipline itself started with the European colonizers going out and observing the people that their nation had so recently conquered in the what sort of 17th, 18th centuries particular. But the strand that's more relevant to market research probably comes from the French philosophical school of linguists and literary theorists, which includes people like Lacan and Lévi-Strauss here, and Roland Barthes in his early years. And ethnography was a key element in developing some of their work, and particularly in literary circles, theories of structuralism. The notion that to understand literature you have to understand the culture and the myths and the rituals and the codes that it uses and that it derives from. And of course you do this from the perspective of its members. And I do think that this is very relevant to market research today, because this is what we're doing most of the time, whether we're studying social issues or brands and communication. We're relying on our knowledge of society's codes and rituals to do so. So while structuralism itself has been questioned as a school of literary criticism, it's absolutely valid, I think, for marketing analysis to ask questions like, what did the author intend by this piece of communication? That is, after all, what's on most of our research briefs if we work in that area of research. Back to ethnography, though, and it was this school of thought and this circle of literary criticism that led on through Barthes to semiotics. And of course, who wouldn't rather be a semiotician than a core researcher? And I do think that's why ethnography as a term is so seductive to us. There's more than a whiff of Gaulois and Jean-Paul Sartre about it. But in practical terms, actually living in a particular social subgroup that we're studying isn't particularly easy, nor that scientific, if you ask me. I certainly always wondered what effect the presence of a white European intellectual in a tribe in Papua New Guinea was going to have on their behaviour. And I suspect that's what was on this cartoonist's mind as well. So a more observational form of ethnography quickly developed, where by definition the observer being outside of the society was not affecting the behaviour. It's all much more of a remote process. And this is where field notes, the notes that people would actually take while they were observing a society or a group of individuals in the field, developed as primary data of the purest form. I think we do still see a bit of this in public and social research. And interestingly, I think perhaps you could argue that a lot of social media research today would fall into this category, because by definition you're observing subjects, you aren't able to influence them, because you're observing their comments and their behaviour from a distance, and obviously slightly in the past in most cases. But generally speaking, in its original form, this is now just too time-consuming and consequently too expensive for today's research world. And the advent of portable video cameras in the late 80s and 90s meant that we could actually observe people without being there ourselves and let the camera do the work. And this is where we first met CMAC, pictured here working on some of the earliest applications of ethnographic footage at everyday lives. Now, CMAC always argued that people forgot about the camera within an hour or two, but I think there's a big difference between fixed camera and having someone following you around. So some of the best so-called ethnography was looking at defined location-specific rituals, such as shopping or doing the laundry. Now, for these physically fixed locations, quality video is still a great option. And again, anyone who was at the MRS conference this year will have seen, I hope, an award-winning example presented by Aileen Mills of BAM and her Finnish client, looking at the role of the dishwasher in family rituals, which of course is absolutely fixed and central. And their observation was the way that this could become was positioned, physically positioned, at the heart of family life. Having said that, I do think even with a fixed camera, it's hard to tell the extent to which people are acting up, quite possibly subconsciously, but often not so subconsciously. It's obvious to any researcher, or I hope it is these days, that reality TV has altered people's relationship with video cameras in general. There's a real tendency to be the person you want to be, or in the case of Gogglebox, of course, the people the producers, the researchers think will be entertaining to the rest of us. Now, digital video also introduced another important tool to ethnography. Now you could quickly and easily edit footage from observational ethnography and then go back to your subjects and quiz them about their behaviour in what ethnographers like to call a co-discovery, but you and I would probably recognise as a depth interview. Now, theoretically, of course, this offers the best of both worlds. You can observe the behaviour and then you can prompt people afterwards to explain why they did something, which should get round the observer effect, but it does sometimes encourage more rational explanation of the behaviour than was actually the case at the time, as we'll explore further in a minute. Before we do that, though, the final step, and arguably the most significant for research, and certainly for the notion of mobile ethnography, the explosion of smartphone ownership. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with this photo, or this series of photos. If not, then make yourself familiar with them. By all means, use them. What you've got here is the election of, or the announcement of the election of two most recent popes, Pope Benedict in 2005 and Pope Francis in 2013. Of course, smartphone ownership, of course, predates 2013. If you look at the 2005 example, you've got the early adopter with the flip phone in the bottom right-hand corner there. But what has happened, and this is literally in the last few years, is that it's now considered completely normal and completely mainstream to take pictures of yourself and your environment, and even to video record chunks of your life while you're out and about, in not just a still selfie, but a video selfie culture. You can't really blame the Holy Father for this personally, but he's certainly no stranger to it, as you can see here. I do think this is probably, as I say, the single biggest agent of change in terms of ethnography, and it has a huge effect on research techniques and the possibilities open to us. Because where ethnography used to be the preserve of very small samples of in-depth analysis and very, very large budgets in most cases, now it's becoming universally acceptable, and it's treated, importantly, as universally applicable, which is my first big implication point, because I do think actually what we're doing is combining two very different and sometimes incompatible methods of data collection and analysis. So, for instance, diaries and pre-tasks and even communities could be considered quite ethnographic in that they do represent real life outside of a research hothouse, and in many cases they're intended to. But what they do is they make respondents very self-conscious, which in turn tends to sway them more towards the rational. And that's a phenomenon which is pretty well known. But I wonder how much we're really conscious of this when we're using that data. And even if we are conscious of it, how do we aim off for it? The reason I chose these examples is that all are increasingly being done using the same techniques that we call mobile ethnography. And I think that this might be quite dangerous because we like to think of mobile research as ethnography because it sounds so much better than a diary study. In actual fact, I think that most mobile ethnography isn't ethnographic research as such, let alone ethnography specifically. But the trouble is it leads us to think that the data is ethnographic. In many cases it plainly isn't. It's answering very specific questions about how people think or behave or buy or consume in very specific circumstances, which is a long way away from the discipline and intention of ethnography. You might ask, well, what's the difference? And if there is a difference, does it actually matter? And I'll argue that it does. It matters because as researchers we have an assumption that what our respondents tell us is true, or that we have the skills in moderation and analysis to interpret the truth from what they're saying and the way that they're saying it. I don't know about you, but as a qualitative researcher, the research effect is something I'm aware of without having to think about too deeply. I take pains to be conscious of it. When I'm moderating groups or depths, I pay attention to the non-verbal signals and to the non-rational ways people use to express emotion. And then in analysis, I aim off for those things and I interpolate outputs which I think are correct. But that's my craft skill, And that's what makes me a moderator and a researcher, not a transcriber or a reporter. But the difference is that with unmoderated ethnographic data, I can't do that, or only with great difficulty, because I'm not there. I can't see people talking. I can't judge their body language so easily. And that means I have to switch to a different mindset, where I should be thinking consciously about how my research methodology is affecting the data I get out, not just the details, but the whole kind of tone and the character of the data that I'm using. Which leads me to wonder why we don't consider this more often. And I think one reason might be that observer effect is something that people only really think about in relation to scientific experiments. And rather like the destructive world of ethnography, this takes us into the rather sexier world of quantum physics, and you can start bandying around names like Heisenberg and Schrödinger. Now, in the case of Schrödinger, of course, the whole paradox is based on whether or not the poor cat had been poisoned while stuck in a box with a Geiger counter and some radioactive particles. So it's really no wonder that we shy away from this sort of material. This is the kind of thing that can't possibly be relevant to us as researchers. But I think it is, although the sort of observer effect I'm talking about is the much less glamorous and less well-known Hawthorne effect. I say less well-known. A straw poll I conducted at the nursery before doing the original webinar suggests that you have to be a particularly attentive psychology graduate to know much about this. What you're looking at here is the Western Electric works at Hawthorne in the outskirts of Chicago, which was the site in the 1930s, I think, of a series of industrial experiments where researchers did a range of things to change working conditions in an attempt to improve the workers' productivity. And specifically things like brighter lighting, introducing work breaks, rest breaks, and better working conditions generally. Now, the key thing about this is that the workers were told about these research experiments taking place. And the result was, and the key thing about it was that every time the conditions changed, whether they were for better or for worse, productivity actually increased. Even if the lighting was getting dimmer again, productivity went up. And there were various theories around at the time and since as to why this was happening. At the time, people tended to the theory that this was because the workers liked being consulted, which was quite unusual in those days, of course. Other theories, and particularly more recently, is that simply knowing that they were in a research experiment actually made them more diligent. They knew that they were being observed, and they tended to consequently to work better because they were part of the experiment. I think there's a very close equivalent to us, and that's analysing the buying process with customer journeys and so on. Any research, really, where the brief is to understand people's behaviour. We've all seen how respondents attempt to seem diligent, seem to take things seriously. They don't want to be seen to buy or to buy something or to change their behaviour on a whim or to be consciously affected by marketing or brand activity. And then having identified their own behaviour, they tend to read that pattern into other parts of the journey too, and you end up with a kind of a virtuous circle of rational, carefully planned out customer journeys that people are keen to impress on us. I think customer journey research is particularly at risk for several reasons, because it's actually at the intersection of a lot of different influences. So one is this effect that the presence of the researcher or being conscious of the research affects the respondent's behaviour. Another is that with customer journey researchers, as researchers, we force people into a more rational as well as more diligent mindset as well. This is just when we need ethnography most, but it's just when many of our research techniques let us down, because the technological advantages that mean that we can track people's journeys and their purchase patterns and segment them according to their behaviour are also almost exclusively rational. Now, a lot of these techniques, of course, are quantitative, but even the qual ones are based around asking people rational questions about how they make their decisions. And because a lot of this is remote, particularly the newer technologies where we're relying on sort of digital recording and stuff, the remoteness of it means that we're stripping out the sensitive, contextual stuff that as good qualities we can use to uncover emotional behaviours. And instead, we're sending people off on their kind of buying journeys, armed with our apps and our sort of digital applications to record this stuff. But we're giving them predetermined questions which are based on our own or our clients' expectations of how people make decisions or follow particular journeys. And then a third influence is that more often than not, we're actually asking people to recall their influences, which again puts undue emphasis on proper behaviour and landmark rational events, which are the ones that people tend to be able to recall because they've stuck in the mind rationally. So in effect, we're not only modifying our respondents' behaviour, we're also tipping the scales massively in favour of rational System 2 thinking, when we know that decisions are really made using System 1 shortcuts with all their emotional triggers. Now these are the barely unconscious influences that ethnography should be able to help us with. But simply sticking our questions and hypothesised journey steps onto a smartphone app doesn't pass for ethnography. We're still sending people out on tasks of our own devising and asking them to follow paths that we guess are the journeys that they're about to make. Now this is fine for understanding steps on defined journeys that we know people are going to make regardless of us researchers. So buying a cup of coffee, for instance, or doing a supermarket shop. Self-contained journeys that we know are there already. But it's much less appropriate for understanding decision-making influences in a wider context. The sort of System 1 influences that are unpredictable and that come from outside category expectations. It's our reliance on rational questions that skews the methodology and the data to System 2 thinking and turns our respondents into conscious subjects who modify their behaviour in often well-intentioned attempts to make the researchers happy and to be seen to be doing a good job. Now in a moment I'll go on to explain what we've been doing to try and get around this, but this isn't meant to be a one product sales pitch. There are other ways of getting the ethnographic back into mobile and digital research, and they also have applications in researching people's experiences, behaviours and buying journeys. The first one I think is something probably most colleagues are familiar with now. Lifelogging cameras, such as narrative clip. It's probably the best known, but there are plenty of others. The point of these are they're so small that they really don't intrude on or theoretically shouldn't influence behaviour. They just cheerily sit there minding their own business, taking a picture at preset intervals of whatever you're doing. And that's the problem, I think, with these. Like observational ethnography, these cameras will capture stuff regardless of whether it's at all relevant to the task at hand. It really is life logging, as in all of life. And of course that's fine if your brief is to actually understand how much of someone's life they actually spend doing a particular task. Most of our briefs are likely to be to capture a specific element of that life. So an alternative is the sort of selective life logging where respondents record specific tasks or events in quite high quality now, either using a dedicated camera or even just an app on their smartphone. And we do use these ourselves increasingly to record a specific experience, such as using a product or following a known pattern. But I'd argue that these are barely ethnographic because what we're actually doing is we're asking people to follow set tasks. Now, I'm quite sure technology will get there. We'll be able to marry the ethnographic kind of capture everything approach with the high quality video once we've worked out how to use some beast of an algorithm to detect the video footage that's relevant to the journey that we're trying to follow, rather than relying on people to do that ourselves. Now, of course, many people saw Google Glass as the holy grail of customer journey research, and indeed the holy grail of quite a lot of things. But quite apart from that same issue of how to handle the vast amounts of footage that it would generate, there's also quite a few other problems to sort out before we can consider this a mainstream research tool. Now, Google, of course, isn't the sort of like organisation to let something like public opinion get in its way. So we will see a wearable that we can use for ethnography, and my guess would be sooner rather than later. How quickly it's accepted is probably another matter. Meanwhile, it does have its applications, and in fact in the same session as us at the MRS this year, Marie Wolf of Unilever showed us how they've been working with one of their incubation startups, We See Through, to develop research applications for Google Glass. And I think it does tick a lot of ethnographic boxes once the respondents have got used to wearing it. But even then, it's still pretty abnormal, so there has to be some kind of an observer effect. And because you couldn't stray too far out of Shoreditch without being punched for wearing one of these, it's probably limited to specific in-home tasks. So a bit like fixed cameras, but with a first-person view. And actually, that's exactly where Marie's examples were set. We were looking at people doing tasks in the home. What it does do very well, though, I think, is to remove some of the rational bias from questions and tasks. And so there's a much reduced Hawthorne effect once people have got used to them. And Marie showed us, for instance, an example of a woman preparing a family meal and confessing to a taste for eating bits of raw chicken, which is hardly over-diligent and not the sort of thing that you'd ever hear in a group discussion or even in a one-to-one interview with a researcher. There's some other apps around, smartphone apps, which don't rely on the rational questioning model. The best known is probably the rather oddly named Experience Fellow here. Less odd than it sounds, actually, because it's really designed to follow customer service experience, particularly in the tourism and hospitality industries. And finally, there is a different approach which is being developed at the moment by the same team that built Journey HQ for us, but it's nothing to do with us at the nursery. It's called Optimo. It's launching this autumn, I believe. And I think it might be worth looking out for, because although it's more of a traditional mobile ethnography app, by which I mean not really that ethnographic, it does have some features which allow it to get around the issue of predetermined tasks. So, for instance, you can set prompts using geolocations or NFC beacons, so that when a respondent enters a particular location, it will then prompt questions which are relevant to that location, but not until you get there. So you don't prompt people to go shopping when they wouldn't have. It just asks the relevant questions when you get there. So moving on to our solution then, and as I say, we were keen to work with CMAG because he has a great ethnographic research background, and he'd already developed the smartphone app Ethos, which I believe was the first of the task and question-based research apps, and I'm sure many people will be familiar with. Our brief to CMAG was this: we wanted to capture journey influences in real time to avoid the whole recall bias. We wanted to avoid the rationalization and the over-diligence of having researchers asking questions and influencing people that way. And we wanted to dial up the capture of people's emotions. We were conscious that we were always going to be a research tool that people were using. So we thought it was fair to try and balance out the inevitable tendency towards rational thinking. And the solution to this was to create an app which effectively has no questions. It simply captures experiences with as few prompts as possible and no questions or tasks at all. So like good ethnographers, we then don't ask people to do certain things. We simply recruit people who are on a particular journey, and then we brief them very carefully, because this is the only chance that we get to tell them what we want. We brief them in advance to capture anything that occurs. And this is where we take pains to spell out that it's not just the big things that would make it into any research study, but the little seemingly insignificant happenings that we know are likely to betray real System 1 triggers. And we restrain ourselves from asking researchery questions, and instead we ask people to put each event into a category, such as seeing an ad or chatting to friends or going shopping, and then leave it at that. And Journey HQ then tracks their journeys as they unfold over time and can compare events by participant and by category. And because people have their phones with them the whole time and they're comfortable chatting into them and snapping or videoing their lives, it really isn't that intrusive or distorting. And we were really pleased to see that what's actually quite functionally quite small changes to the design of the app can generate a completely different kind of response. Where with other methodologies people know that somewhere along the line a researcher is going to ask them why they did something, what we found with Journey HQ is that people are freed from that expectation and send us events which might seem inconsequential, but when you string them together and put them into context with other people, give us a fascinating snapshot of some of the less rational and less predictable, more System 1 type of influences. And here I've got a couple of examples that illustrate that. We can get rid of this looping video. First, you'll remember that there's a range of categories for participants to choose from. These are different, of course, for each project. We get them set up in advance, and so they usually represent the client's existing knowledge, or perhaps I should say received wisdom. But we also include a category named Other, and sometimes also Random Thoughts, so as not to restrict people to what we expect their journey to be. And this is just as well because not only do these categories attract events, they've together been the single biggest category of all in every project that we've done. I've just dug out 3 examples to here that show that most influences they're either things that have never occurred to the client team, or more often, they're things that they were aware of, but they'd always discounted because they'd never appeared on one of the rational journey maps, which of course we provide the setup contexts of the other categories. Now, some of these things that go into the other or the random thoughts category really are inconsequential, of course, but many aren't. And here's just two examples of how, by not asking people questions, we've captured some triggers that would have never made it into a traditional rational research study. So by her own admission, on the top left there, this participant in an accolade study wouldn't have put this into a traditional diary or bothered to tell a researcher about it. But because she had her phone with her and you asked her to capture even the silly little thoughts, she did, and so did plenty of others, like the one on the right there as well. And it turns out, in fact, that the bigger spike in accolade purchase isn't hot weather per se, but going on holiday. My second example, briefly, is of an instance where major influences were literally unplanned and unforeseen from a new car buying study. Surely you'd have thought something as high ticket as a car entails a detailed, rigorous journey with a rational, well-researched decision at the end of it. Our clients have always sniffed at the idea that people buy cars on the basis of colour or just plain road envy. So again, we set up all the expected rational categories, all the ones you'd expect in the colour coding here, but we had so many entries in other that we actually had to create a whole new category. You can see in red here, called Seen Cars on the Road. And that gives you an idea just of the volume of contributions into that category. And here come some examples of that.
Let's have a little look what colour it is and what colour the interior is.
Yes, I was just coming home from work and I was at the lights in the outside lane. I stopped next to the car that I liked, a Mercedes C-Class. It was in white, it was just nice seeing it. It was a nice model, plenty spec on it, and it made me even more interested in the model and the vehicle.
You'll be pleased to hear I've also taken out some video here, which is probably as well because I think the respondent in question could have been answering some questions from the police as he videoed cars that he saw on the way home. And literally saying, I like the look of this car, this is going on my shortlist, this looks great, this makes me want to go and try this model out. Now, I've been doing car research for years, and I've never heard people articulate quite so clearly how much they're influenced by chance encounters with good-looking cars, and particularly in the colour that they're seduced by. And white seems to have been very big at Manchester last year. My last example is my favourite. It's also the most butchered by the lack of video, but it shows a different kind of research effect, which is pure post-rationalisation. And this is a study of parents about to buy their kids their first phone. So these are kids who were starting secondary school last autumn. This is a project that we did a year ago, just about now. And of course, starting secondary school, for those of you who aren't parents of teenagers, you lucky things, is a very big trigger for getting a phone. We had tons of stuff about how responsible and cautious parents were, how they impressed on their kids that a phone, particularly their first phone. They're off to big school. It's a functional, basic communications tool. It's a way of keeping in touch. And the last thing they were going to do was to send them to school to be mugged for their new iPhone. They were going to buy a rational, functional piece of communications kit that they could make phone calls with and send the odd text message. And amusingly, but not I'm afraid for this version of the presentation because we haven't got the video, we had loads of examples of how the kids have learned to play this game too. We had a couple of examples here of kids recording their pieces to the camera, towing the party line, explaining how useful it was going to be for them to have a phone so that they could be picked up in emergencies when their play date was over, rather than their mum having to come and hang around and having to arrange play dates for them. We have a little girl talking about how she was going off to a different school from her friends and she would need the phone. She could make her own arrangements and it would make her more responsible. So it's all about this very kind of rational communication. Now, we conducted traditional research. This is the picture we've got. Lots of rational, carefully thought through arguments to show the researchers and to reassure themselves that our respondents were making a sensible, informed choice. but there was a great big strand of pester power, very irrational pester power running through every household. And this was mainly Apple. And again, video here of 5 or 6 kids, one after the other, spelling out in very clear detail the phone that they wanted. This time last year was the iPhone 5C. Very attractive to kids because of the different coloured jacket, plastic jacket things on the phone. Well, guess what? Far from the functional feature phone that the parents had in mind, every single child in the survey got the 5C that they wanted, except for the girl bottom left here who preferred the camera on the Sony, so she got that in order to allow her to be more responsible and arrange her play dates. Yes, of course. But we know that if we hadn't recorded these journeys in real time, if we'd been there effectively asking people to explain their purchases as researchers, we'd have missed this big brand effect as well. Because even without us, the parents managed to come up with post-rationalizations, literal post-rationalizations in most cases, to justify this indulgent change of tack. And they are frankly ludicrous. There's some of my favourite examples here. Apple is easier to sync. Superseding models made it a bargain. It'll help him make more friends. And my absolute favourite, it's more durable. So good luck with that, new Apple owners. I think there's just 3 examples there of how by minimising the intrusion and cutting out the questions and not sending people on specific tasks, but just letting them get on with their lives, we can get a bit more of the ethnography back into ethnographic research. There's loads of different ways of doing it. Ours is just one. And when I say ours, I don't mean the nurseries. If you're interested in this, then get in touch with Sophie, who runs it, and we will never know that you called. So my parting thought would be that, like all that's good about QOL, there's no right way or wrong way. There's just different ways. But the important thing with this to remember is which way you're going down and what the implications of that are for your choice of methodology, and most importantly, for the kind of data that it's going to produce. So it really is horses for courses. Mobile research has great strengths. It's great for understanding specific issues or events or themes in detail. But if you have to direct people to those themes, then there is a research effect. And like most research techniques, it does skew people to the rational. And you have to be aware of that, and you have to aim off for it somehow. And often you can't. You just have to accept the fact that you're just seeing the rational side of the picture. Ethnographic research, on the other hand, and don't think we should call it ethnography, it is ethnographic research, research that uses ethnographic techniques, can give you a broader picture with more of a real-life context. But it does have huge drawbacks in that you won't always capture the key moments, and because you're at a distance, you can't direct respondents to answer your questions, which of course makes it an ideal complementary methodology to fill in some of those System 1 gaps or to set the scene from a blank sheet of paper. But it's never going to give you all the answers. And finally, perhaps a rather surprising conclusion, and one that I'd welcome comments on and disagreement with, even if in the post-recorded mode you have to do this by email, which is that some of these newer methodologies are surprisingly ethnographic and may become more so, while some of the things that we call ethnography really aren't, even if they are incredibly useful mobile research techniques. So for instance, things like video logging, if it's on demand, any so-called ethnographic app, as long as it's based on setting people tasks and asking them questions, video wearables, because of the intrusive nature of the device itself for the moment, and certainly mobile diaries, are great at capturing things in the moment, but they are by no means ethnographic. Whereas the ethnographic techniques, or the ones that come closest to ethnographic research, are always on lifelogging, if you can really afford to log an entire life. Apps which are more ethnographic, ones like Journey HQ that don't have questions in them, Experience Fellow perhaps. Fixed camera ethnography, good old-fashioned fixed camera ethnography, where the thing that you want to capture is in a place where the camera needn't intrude. And as I said, perhaps rather surprisingly, the concept of lumping social media research with these as a way of actually observing society, or observing the way people behave without affecting them. At the nursery, we're going to carry on using all of these techniques, and probably, to be honest, more of the ones on the left than on the right, because actually they're closer to answering our clients' briefs, which have some very specific tasks and questions around them. But what we're going to try and do is to be much more conscious of the gap between the two kinds, and to treat our data and to manage our clients' expectations accordingly. And that's it. Thank you very much.